Welcome, everyone, to Color Commentary. We are your popper commentators, Michael Petchik and Adrian Gonzalez. How's it going, Adrian?
Oh, you know, good.
Good. Yeah, we had a pretty quality pre-show here. Yeah.
Hopefully, we don't get too goofy today in the actual show.
We can get a little goofy. I feel like we've earned it. We've done some serious episodes lately.
There's going to be some clowning.
You know me. I'm always down to clown. But let's take care of the
whoop whoop.
Don't you bring this evil into my house. We've got some upkeep to take care of. First off, let's get these out of the way. We're brought to you in part by Original Magic Art. Original Magic Art is providing all sorts of super cool sleeves and playmats and dice bags and art prints of magic art and non-magic art and historical art, all sorts of really cool things. I was just on their website. They are currently printing playmats, official licensed playmats at that, of Nils Ham's version of Fast Bond, which, you know, for those of you privy to the pre-show, we certainly hollered about our opinions on the art for Fast Bond, but they've got all sorts of really cool products there. We had Josh on the show a couple months ago now, and we stand by his products. He's a good guy, and he clearly loves what he does. So if you decide that you want to go over there and pick yourself up some nice magic accoutrement, you can use the promo code Commontary, all caps, spelled exactly as it is in the name of this podcast, and you'll get 5% off your order. And we get a little bit of a kickback from it. So you're helping keep the lights on here over at the Color Commentary headquarters, and you're also getting a little bit of a deal. Just getting that pot sweetened just a little bit. Adrian, what do you got for us?
Who doesn't like a sweet pot? Well, we've recently updated our Patreon. If you subscribe now for just $1, you can talk to us all week, and you can listen to our pre-show, which sometimes is pretty good, like today, but sometimes it's not so good. So maybe, I don't know, you get life gives you lemons and you make lemonade. You know, that's all I'm trying to say here. I'm getting real worked up over this for now. I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah, we're on Patreon.
Yeah. And when Adrian says you can talk to us all week, we have a private Discord channel for our patrons, and it's pretty enjoyable. I have a good time being able to directly interact with fans of this show, because it's folks like you bring it to this. Folks like you are the reason this show continues to exist. There we go.
Yeah, exactly. We're professionals. So we've sort of gone down this new road where we're trying to at least eschew the deck text. Mike and I have kind of run out of decks to talk about, and so we're actually relying pretty heavily on our Discord in order to provide us with what we hope most of our fans would like to hear from the show. So today we're sort of twisting it a little bit, but we're taking Job, one of our patrons, conversation topics. And he mentioned in the Discord about wanting to talk about, where do you determine the sideboard cards or something like that. And we've sort of transformed it into a discussion of how do you know how many copies of a card you want in a given 75 list?
Yeah. And this is one of those things that is sort of, it's a vital skill for people who are trying to brew their own lists or even tweak an existing list, because in order to see all the cards in your deck, you got to put in a lot of time, and there's some guidelines that can kind of help shortcut that a little bit. So you're not, you don't brew up every possible permutation of 75 cards given a certain card pool. You actually start somewhere.
And actually our personal popper play group, typically most of the discussions do hinge around nutting and bolting, if you will, different decks and trying to figure out really what is the exact configuration that you want. Mostly has to do with Tron, because that has a lot of flex slots. But you could apply some of the concepts we're going to talk about today to a lot of decks. Maybe not every single one of them, but a lot of them.
And that is important to talk about. Like there are lists that are much more sort of solidly established. Stompy lists do not present a whole lot of variety, and if you look at the challenges, you'll see people running the exact same 75 in the top 32. But this is talking mostly to the brewing side, but also a little bit to the tuning side. So we've kind of broken it out into four categories, excuse me. Cards that you want as 3 to 4 ofs, cards that you want as 1 to 2 ofs, cards that you want more than 5 copies of, which we'll address later, and sideboard cards. So do you just want to get into this one, Adrian?
Yeah, let's do it. So you want to just alternate here?
Yeah.
All right, so the 3 to 4 ofs are copies of cards that you want to see every single game. And Mike has here listed blue cantrips like Ponder, Preordain, not necessarily Brainstorm in our format, but the best example I can think of that is playing a high density of cantrips currently is definitely the Tribe combo deck. It wants to draw to its combo pieces as quickly as possible, which is Mike's next section here, which is the engine cards. You want the cards that you're going to be able to use to win the game. So go ahead.
Yeah. And also for synergy driven decks. For example, last week we talked about Tortured Existence, a deck that revolves around one enchantment where there is no second copy of Tortured Existence. You don't get more versions of it. So you got to run the 4 because the deck really kind of revolves around it.
Mike, the name of the deck is not Tortured Existence, as we've established. It's time. It's time for the clown.
Yeah. So today, literally hours before we recorded this, an instant deck tech went up for MTG Goldfish for the deck formerly known as Tortured Existence and now forevermore known as Fog Frog Dredge.
Yeah, okay. So now that we've established the name of the deck as Fog Frog. God, sorry, I'm trying not to swear. Fog Frog Dredge. Yes, you want your engine cards. But more particularly, I was also thinking, let's take like Stompy, for example. You want to draw all your copies of Rancor.
Yeah, and so I plugged in some stuff to the hypergeometric calculator. So in your opening hand, and we're going to try and breeze through this as quickly as possible. In your opening hand, if you have the odds of having more than one copy of a card are as follows. If you have one copy in your deck, you have roughly an 11.5% chance of having it in your opener. If you have 2 copies, having one or more in your opening hand jumps up to 22%. At 3 copies, 31.5%, and at 4 copies, just shy of 40% chance of having at least one in your opening hand. So you can kind of see like it doesn't quite perfectly scale, but it's more or less you're adding around 10 to 11% of the odds that you're going to draw one copy of it in your hand at the beginning of the game, assuming no mulligans. So by the time we get to about turn 3, the numbers sort of stratify a little bit further. 1 copy is at 16%, 2 copies is at 30%, 3 copies is at 42%, and 4 copies is at 53%. So the big thing here is if you're running 4 copies of a card and no other card draw, by the time turn 3 rolls around, there's a better than 50% chance that you have drawn at least one copy of that card. So
never works for me.
Yeah, never works for anyone who actually tries to apply this logic. These are just numbers and statistics are lies. But the key thing here is looking at, the difference between a 1 of and a 4 of by turn 3. You're talking about a factor of, over 3 times as likely. And, just in the opener alone, you're talking about almost 4 times as likely. So it is a good thing to keep in mind that those numbers, you're not 4 times as likely to draw a copy of something you have 4 copies of, but it's pretty close. So
yeah, that's really the bedrock of our discussion today is probabilities and numbers and lies.
And I cannot recommend enough that after this podcast is over, if you want a better breakdown of these numbers and a much more scientific approach, go check out Frank Karsten's articles over on Channel Fireball. I believe he actually has he has some sort of degree in mathematics, and he does a lot of breakdowns of this sort of thing. Like he's got a great article about building a mana base from a mathematical standpoint that I really enjoy.
which is why we're always part of the train of people who say that land is very undervalued in Pauper. I do understand it's a format of increments and you need every advantage you can get, but there are definitely some crazy mana bases out there. I'll tell you what.
So returning back to our point about the four ofs. So these are cards you want to see every game. You're not statistically likely to see them every game, but you want the best chance you have. And even a three of, you've got a good chance.
That was actually my question. How do you determine if you want a 3 of or a 4 of?
Now, I think that this is an area where you get into a lot more detail. And what I've generally used as a guideline, and this is about the furthest thing I can do since we were just talking about like numbers that were delivered by a hypergeometric calculator. This is one that I play by ear. This is, it oftentimes having a 4 of for creatures, it's a lot more difficult to tell because a creature, even if, it has an ETB trigger that's not immediately relevant, it's at least a body that's helping advance the actual board state. What I generally find is the slightly more situational cards are easier to identify when, you're drawing it dead sometimes, but most of the time it's alive and it's kind of underperforming, situational removal, for example, I think, or situational counterspells are definitely a good example of something where if the metagame is mostly in a place where it's relevant, but there's a couple of major decks that it's not relevant against, that's the point where I start considering maybe it's time to cut this down to a 3 of. What about you?
I don't know. I'm not very good at math. I'm just going to agree with what you said, which is a cop out. But the numbers really lose me, and I'm sad to say that, but I'm just not very good at this kind of stuff, unfortunately. And that's I don't know. I think your argument makes sense.
Well, here's the thing. For example, you recently. Well, I guess this would have been about a month ago. You talked about putting a copy of Sen's Enlistment into Boros Monarch. So let's say you had a new thing that you wanted to try out in Boros Monarch and you just wanted to play it as a singleton because you thought that was a good idea. What out of that deck would you say, you know what, I can probably shave one of these and be okay?
Probably one of my Prophetic Prisms.
Okay, there you go. You've identified something that you feel is either expendable or not really pulling its weight. And in this case, it's more the former than the latter. But that's how I generally wind up with 3 ofs in my list.
Gotcha. So you just make a little bit of room for something. That's generally how I do it. I look at the deck and I'm good. I can do that. But okay, I see what you're saying now. Sorry.
Yeah. What I generally find is when I'm making a new deck, 3 ofs are usually the least common, and that may be a flaw of the way I approach deck building, but I generally find that, I either want 4, 2, or 1, and 3 ofs are kind of the rarity, and that those usually wind up after I've been testing a list. I wind up going, this could be a 3 of. And I'd probably
you don't really need 4. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So the other thing that we have here that we want to touch on is for those 3 and 4 ofs, these are either, things you want to see every game. Another big key thing, I think, is a lot of the time you'll see your early drops, your things you want to hit turn 1, turn 2 as 4 ofs. And this is generally because, playing
you have the highest probability of having them in your opening hand and drawing them later, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You have 7 cards in your opener.
Yeah. And playing like a 1 of Llanowar Elves is kind of silly because you're very unlikely to have it in your opener where it's going to matter the most. But every card you draw from there on out has pretty similar chances of being that Llanowar Elves that is not great after like turn 4. So, anything that's vital to your early game and you really want to see, you want as a 4 of. And looking at Stompy again as an example, a lot of cards in that deck are 4-ofs. And it's just because all of them are good turn one plays.
Yeah, that deck is very low to the ground, and so it needs to eke out all the stuff it can. Plus, it doesn't have any card draw. Like you have to basically have to win with your opener.
Yeah. It plays similar to Burn in that respect, where you want to maximize the density of redundant effects that synergize well together. Now for one and 2-ofs. So this is where things get tricky, because 1 and 2-ofs, even so a singleton copy of a card by turn 6, you have about a 20% chance of having drawn it. And turn 6, if that card's at all important to you, it's probably not. In a lot of scenarios, it's going to be a little bit too late. Obviously there are cards that are still valuable when drawn on turn 6, and the 1-ofs and 2-ofs are kind of, the things you don't want to see every game. And we made a note here about teachings, and I guess, do you want to kind of address the teachings 1-ofs?
Yeah, sure. So Mystical Teachings is a card that lets you grab a card with flash or an instant card. So Teachings, as it used to be this toolbox deck where it would run a bunch of 1-of instants, definitely 4 copies of some cards like Teachings itself, for example, but you could afford to play a bunch of 1-ofs to really get the card that suited the situation. And so I think that was a big appeal, and still is probably a big appeal of that type of deck, is it just lets you toolbox, which I think is really what we're talking about. We're talking about toolbox decks as a whole, not even just in our format, but let's think about green black rock style decks in Legacy, where they have access to cards like Green Sun Zenith. They can just go get whatever they want.
Yeah, and even for people playing EDH, there's a lot of tutors in that format, which
But decks all fun-ofs.
Yeah, it's literally a format of fun-ofs. It's that taken to an extreme, but tutors allow you to have virtual extra copies of a card. Obviously, if I have 1 Doomblade in my deck and I'm playing Teachings, I don't actually have 5 copies of, or I guess 9 copies of Doomblade. But I have 9 cards, which I have 9 quote unquote cards, if you're counting the flashback on Teachings, that can let me get to that card immediately. And
so it lets you toolbox.
Yeah. And this is something you see less in this format, because the reason we're talking so heavily about Teachings here is it's one of the only really efficient tutors in the format. Last week, the deck we spoke about, does mill itself pretty heavily. And for graveyards synergy decks, that can be a form of, not quite tutoring, but certainly something similar.
And we are differentiating a little bit this sort of mechanic from Transmute, which we'll get into in our 5+ ofs. I do think that they are. There is a subtle difference between this and that, namely the fact that you're running 4 copies of the card plus the Transmute cards. Yeah. Whereas this is like you want to run an effective 9 copies of a card just in case you need it, or just in case you need something else.
Yeah, and Teaching is definitely one of the better examples of this sort of effect. Now the other thing that you don't want high counts of are things that are bad in multiples. And what would you say some examples of that are?
I think the big one is Gush. Gush alternative casting cost is a return 2 islands to your hand. Once you've done that, you no longer have 2 islands to return. So it can gum up your hand for a little bit. And the other big one that I suggested earlier was retrace spells. Well, I think maybe you did, because retrace you basically get to discard a land card in order to cast a spell again from your graveyard. And so if you have 2 of them, it's not the best. And then you mentioned Forbidden Alchemy. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Dimir Alchemy as a deck, and the deck has never run Alchemy as a 4-of. It usually sits in a sweet spot between 2 and 3, depending on your exact list. And part of it is the fact that it has flashback. So Forbidden Alchemy's functionally kind of come in 2s, because you're going to get the first use and then later you're going to get the second use. You don't have to draw into a second copy of it, unlike, for example, Impulse, which is a very similar card. Some key differences, but one of the big things is the second copy of Forbidden Alchemy is just sitting there. The other thing is with Forbidden Alchemy, it puts a strain on another resource, your library, because even though part of your game plan is to mill yourself, you do have to have cards still left in that library so you don't lose to decking yourself. And I think that's another card where, much like again last week we talked about Stinkweed Imp and the fact that that is a very powerful self-mill engine, but you kind of have to be careful about it because it is still a resource that can lead to you losing the game.
Yeah.
And with retrace spells, I'm kind of interested because you've probably played retrace spells more recently and more frequently than I have. Do you want to maybe explain for the folks at home why those generally see play as one and maybe two ofs?
They're really there for, since enlistment particularly is there for the grindy matchups that you can add more bodies to the board so you can eventually win the game. So by taking that like grinding element, you're basically using it to pitch extra lands. Excuse me. In order to gain an advantage later in the game when you no longer need the lands. And so having redundant copies of it doesn't really help you out because either the one copy is going to get there or it's not, because the effects on these cards are like Sin's Enlistments, like it really is just create 2 tokens, and like Raven's Crime is just like they discard a card. Like the effects aren't super duper good all the time, but given in the course of a long game, we're able to do it repeatedly. It is quite good.
And those two are the ones that see the most play, and it's likely in part due to the fact that neither of them are miserable to cast once for full rate and not retrace. So these one-ofs are generally, I'd feel much better about a one-of Raven's Crime than a one-of Duress, if we're being totally honest.
Oh, yeah, because you just get the value of reusing it over again when your lands are no longer of any impact. And in fact, I played a game with Boros Monarch where I was returning lands with my bounce effects to discard them to Sin's Enlistment.
Yeah, the utility of one-ofs is oftentimes a key factor in them being more acceptable, where it's like, if I draw this in a matchup where it's not super relevant, it still does something. But in the matchups where it is super relevant, it's like I got to sideboard from the get-go.
Right.
Like, in as you mentioned, yeah, the very grindy matchups for Monarch, if you draw that copy of Sin's Enlistment, it's one of the best cards you could have found. And in the games where you don't see it, you're not that far behind. It's not an integral part of your plan. And, in the matchups where, for example, Blitz, which is planning to make a very large, very, very hard to block creature, you kind of treat it as an overpriced sorcery speed, raise the alarm and move on. It's not,
right.
It's not completely dead. It's just not as live as it could be. And I think that's a good point to sort of hammer home is these one-ofs should always be at least marginally useful.
Right. Like, yeah, exactly. I also run one of Rally the Peasants in my Boros list, and that's because it just wins you the game if you're able to resolve it effectively. Yeah. Like on the spot wins you the game. And so like that's fine too. Also, it's one of those cards that you get like 2 uses out of. So if you ever mill it or discard it, it's fine.
Yeah. And reusability, as someone who loves limited, keyword abilities like Flashback are super, super elegant design in that it gives cards more value without having to print any more powerful effect on them. And those, as you pointed out, are definitely the things where running them as a one-of is not the end of the world because they're kind of functionally a two-of. So do you want to lead us into the 5+ of categories, the not allowed by the rules category?
Mike, I think I'd rather not. No, I'm joking. Of course I will. So 5-ofs are basically what. So I think the best example that I can think of right off the top of my head is the 4 copies of Jace's Erasure and Turbo Fog. That deck plays transmute cards that it can go and get these other copies of Jace's Erasure to ensure that it's able to play as many of them as it possibly can over the course of the game. So that is a necessary engine card because that's how that deck wins. and it really wants to draw as many as possible. So like we mentioned earlier, it's not like teachings where it's a toolbox. You just get the cards you need to move on. It's actually way more important than that, because you need to be able to draw as many of them as you can. So
yeah, and
go ahead.
In that list, there's also the factor that a lot of that. So for those who don't know, transmute is a static ability on cards that was from the original Ravnica and the Dimir mechanic, and you pay a cost. You pay the transmute cost, you discard the card from your hand, and then you go searching through your library for a card with the same converted mana cost. Very, very important. They're exactly the same. And in that case, not only does Muddle the Mixture get Jace's erasure, but a lot of the fogs that deck plays are also at the 2 mana cost slot. So, it's a combination of a tutor ability, but also is functioning as redundant copies of a very, very vital engine card.
Right.
The other example of this is running redundant cards that are similar or the same. And I think one of the examples I want to point out is Goblins, which runs 4 copies of Goblin Cohort and 4 copies of Mog Conscripts, which is the same card with a different name. Every single bit of those cards is identical.
Yeah, it just wants to have as many of that effect as possible in a deck with a 0 card draw.
Exactly. And there's not a lot of cases where you get that, where you get to run like multiple copies of the exact same card. But you can there's some decks where you can lump things together. On my way home, I was actually thinking about Red Deck Winds, which if you look at the creature base for that, it's most of the creatures fill either the role of a 2/2 for 1 red mana or a 2/2 with haste for 2 mana. And that's just kind of what the deck does. So these, maybe you could touch upon this a little bit with the cantrip artifacts in Monarch.
So yeah, you have as many copies of the cantrip effects in Monarch as you can reasonably. I did mention cutting one earlier, so that you can combo or quote unquote combo synergize with your bounce spells and then generate more card advantage. So that would be an example of that. And then, but each of them do something a little different. So you do have that extra utility.
Yeah, and as I pointed out, there's a couple of cases where there are functional reprints. Elvish Mystic and Fyndhorn Elves and Llanowar Elves are all the same card, barring some creature subtypes. But these are, again, these are when 4 is simply not enough. There's ways to kind of cheat around that rule just a little bit.
Yeah. Speaking of, I think there used to not be that restriction. So if you look at the old Fogey card from one of the unsets, it says 20 Black Lotuses and 20 Plague Rats. Now that's magic.
To be fair, that card also uses phasing, so is bad.
It doesn't. That's the one with star.
Nope. I would definitely go check that card. It uses phasing.
No, it doesn't. Plague Rats is power and toughness, each equal to the number of Plague Rats in play, and it costs 3 mana.
I'm talking about Old Fogey.
Oh no, I was just referencing the flavor text on that card.
Gotcha.
Which says, these kids today with their collector numbers and their newfangled tap symbol, 20 Black Lotuses and 20 Plague Rats. Now that's real magic.
I mean, that is casual talk, because I'm pretty sure 20 Black Lotuses, 20 channels, and 20 fireballs is just going to beat that.
Also, it does ban with dinosaurs, interestingly enough, which is relevant now.
Oh God, it is, isn't it? I just realized that's a thing now.
We warned you it would be a goofy episode.
Yeah. Sadly, despite all my seriousness, we cannot fully escape silver bordered magic this week. So last category of cards is sideboard cards. And what goes into your sideboard, Adrian?
Like me particularly, or like in general, what do people put in their sideboards?
How about both those answers in the order you're choosing?
All right. So generally, I'm going to answer both of them at the same time. I think I put in my sideboards things that I think will make my bad matchups not so bad. And I mean, there are certainly some unwinnable ones that you just don't actually sideboard for. The best example I can think of that would be Modern Jund and Modern Tron. Modern Jund can't beat Modern Tron, so they might as well not even try sideboarding for it. But you want to put cards in your sideboard that will help you in matchups that you might not be able to win usually, or at least maybe bump you from a 50 to a 60 to or a 70 even. And Pauper is full of cards like that because we have such narrow hate cards like Gorilla Shaman or Circular Protections that really let you, like, if you can draw your sideboard card and counteract what your opponent is doing, you'll probably win the game.
So I guess sort of dovetailing onto that, when you're looking at the sideboard of a deck, how do you pick your numbers in there? Because 15 cards is not a lot to cover the entire metagame.
It's tough. I generally do 3 ofs for more common matchups, and then 2 ofs for or particularly bad matchups, and then 2 ofs for less ones. So, for example, my Boros Monarch list has 3 copies of Pyroblast. I want to be able to beat all the blue decks, but it only has 2 copies, or maybe even 1 copy of Cop Red, because I don't really anticipate running into as many red decks.
That, and there are hands out of that deck that are fast and can sort of interact in a generally positive way with those red decks.
Right.
And sideboards obviously are there to shore up your bad matchups. So apart from the hosing cards, you also have sort of the narrow effects, where something is more efficient, such as, the example I have here is Dispel, which is 1 blue, counter an instant. It's not something you want in every matchup because your opponent may not be playing a load of instants, but if they are, it's cheaper than Counterspell. And also narrow effects that target permanent types that are not in every single deck. We're talking stuff like Disenchant, or I guess Smash to Smithereens would be the other one that I'd bring up.
Yeah.
Removal that requires a very specific type of target to be present, but when it is
Flame Slash.
What was that?
I said Flame Slash. I'm just thinking of other cards.
Yeah, I mean, I could see a case where Flame Slash is a sideboard card if you're very good against every deck except Affinity, for example. That's a deck with plenty of 4/4s or X4s.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with these, the narrow effects can be less narrow, if that makes any sense. Like Disenchant, just as an example, is good against Boggles and Affinity, 2 decks that attack on very different axes.
Well, you could also make that same argument for like Pyro and Hydroblast, which are just good. Pyroblast is good because so many decks have blue in them, even though it is itself in a vacuum a very narrow card.
Yeah, and I think also, with one of the other examples that's a pretty egregious hate card is Standard Bearer, which Standard Bearer against Boros Monarch is very bad. It's just going to eat a burn spell. It's going to save you. It's going to be a lone missionary functionally, where it saves you 4 points of damage if you're lucky, and the only thing they have is a Galv Blast. But against a matchup like Boggles or Stompy, it can shut down the entire game until they deal with it. And that's exactly the sort of thing you want in a sideboard. And I guess one of my other questions would be, when you're looking at your metagame, how many sideboard slots do you try to devote to different matchups? I mean, are you sort of trying to balance all the possible matchups you could see, or are you metagaming your sideboard for specific matchups more heavily?
I would say I'm metagaming my matches more heavily. Like, for example, Monarch's worst matchup is Tron, and I don't think that's an unwinnable match. It's not like Jund. Mid-range is typically very much the dog in the Tron matchup, which I guess that it really is Jund's problem too. But in Pauper, I have access to other spells that will help me, and I have the benefit of being the Monarch, which Jund does not have. So as long as you can basically, you need to protect being the Monarch, and then you can probably grind them out of the game. So that's really the key thing there. So bringing in Pyroblast or ways to disrupt their disruption is really key.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty valid point. looking at what's present in the metagame and not just the bad matchups, because even if you have a good matchup against the deck, having a couple of sideboard slots devoted to it to just kind of hammer it home. Because, for example, not to get too technical here, but you can get on that next level play. If you know that your opponent has a bad matchup against you, they may have a bunch of stuff in their sideboard that's really good against you, and you want to kind of prep yourself for game 2 and 3 where they're going to bring all these good cards against you in, and you need a way to resolve your game plan against them. I think probably the clearest example of this would be Elves usually runs a copy of, or at least used to run a copy of Magnify out of the sideboard, which just gives all creatures +1/+1. And the reason you brought that in was because if your opponent was playing red or black, they could have access to stuff like Shrivel or Electrickery, which really, really goozles your game plan. So being able to go, okay, I've got the answer to your answer is a very, very powerful effect to have in Magic.
Yes.
All right. So you've got all these, 3 ofs, 4 ofs, 1 ofs, 2 ofs. I guess let's return to an earlier topic. Once you have your deck list together and you started testing it, how do you alter the numbers as you go?
What do you mean?
Like you've got your new list that you're absolutely loving, and you want to make sure that you're playing the optimal 75. How do you kind of reflect on experiences within games and make alterations to your list from there?
I see what you mean. I would start by looking at what's sat in your hand in a given game. Like, can you think of a card that you maybe even had in your opener, you drew later in the game, and the card really just didn't matter? Like, those are the cards I would look at first, about being like, well, maybe I need less copies, or maybe I don't need it at all. And if I don't need it at all, what can I replace with it? So like when you look at your hand, you want to be able to be like, well, I could do things with everything I'm holding. Obviously, that's the ideal and not really what happens in practice, because let's say you draw, I don't know, your main deck cop green against mono blue Delver. Like, there are definitely exceptions to the rule here. Whereas cop green is very good against other matchups is where I'm going with that. But yeah, you want to look at like, what over the course of this tournament, the course of this league, the course of these couple matches did I draw and then never ever want?
Yeah, and this is sort of a more subjective thing where there's no hard and fast rule about it, because there are those cards where, you're like, I've got a couple flex slots. I'm going to try out some spicy new tech in this deck. And you only see it a handful of times. That's where these decisions get really tricky, because those flex slots are important. It's, every card in your deck matters, because you are going to see over the course of a several round tournament, you're probably going to see a lot of your deck. And
yeah,
you don't always see absolutely every card, and it does make testing, especially with these 1 ofs and 2 ofs, very, very tricky, because you do really have to monitor, all right, I've drawn that 1 of that I thought was going to be crazy. I need to pay attention to this, because if it turns out this card is not as good as I thought, I'm spending a slot on it, and there is a real cost to how you build your deck. Sometimes even more so than how you play it. And
more than you know.
Exactly. But it is really important to continue to analyze. Obviously I don't see a time anywhere in the near future where I can imagine Monarch playing like less than 4 copies of cantrip artifacts total, like 3 prophetic prisms, and that's it. And I can't really see a future where they play much less than, like, I could barely imagine 3 core Skyfishers, let alone less than that.
Yeah, and to be fair, some of them are playing less than 4 copies of the actual Monarch card, but that's because it's slow and kind of clunky sometimes. So
yeah, and that's a great example, because if these cards are just sitting there rotting in your hand, and in that case there's a unique angle which I'll return to, it may be time to trim them. And with regards to the Monarch cards, the cards that actually let you become the Monarch, there's definitely, situations where you don't get full value out of them, where it's like, okay, I've become the Monarch, and now I'm drawing into more things that let me become the Monarch, and I kind of have to sandbag these, and I'm slowing down my game plan as a result of it. And those are situations where you might want to say, maybe trim to 3, so that way I have a little bit more gas once I establish that I'm the monarch. But I don't want to go to 2 because I still want to reliably see these cards and play them as part of my game plan.
Absolutely.
I guess, do you have anything else on this topic? Because this is certainly one of those things where it's very easy to sort of write this off as, you just know. And while we were coming up with the list of stuff for this, there were definitely a couple of things that as we were going, we were like, oh yeah, we should talk about that. So are there any other, I guess, like mistakes you see newer players making when they're working on a list?
I think people get married to their card choices a little too much.
Yeah, you want to go?
They want to. Yeah, especially when brewing, they want to play. I don't know. I'm trying to think of something neutral so it doesn't sound like I'm calling one out, because I'm really not trying to. But like people who want to play 4-copy, people who want to play the elf aggro deck, which is a deck, then they play that card that's. They play like Nissa's Chosen or something like very anemic like that. And it's like most decks just don't really care, but they're like, no, I really want to play aggro elf, so I have to play Nissa's Chosen. And you're just kind of like, well, what's wrong with regular elves? And people can play their fun cards, and that's fine. But I think some people are just like, well, I'm really amped on Nissa's Chosen, so I really want to play it. So I'm going to play this less than ideal deck to do so.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely that sort of focused in echo chamber where people can kind of get into that state where you're not sitting and being critical of what you chose to do.
And I think some people hand wave it away by being like, well, I'm trying to be spicy. And it's like, spicy's good, sure, but like you don't want to sacrifice the integrity of what you're playing in order to be spicy. Then you're just showboating and probably losing.
Yeah, there's definitely like there's the point where that spicy like one of that you wanted to test needs to go away, when you can finally say like, you know what, I was wrong on this one. Like this was not a good call. And I think that's a really important skill to be able to notice, like, you know what, I was wrong. This card wasn't what I thought it was going to be, and I should move on. It was a cool idea, and you shouldn't feel bad about it because you tried it out, and that is a good thing. That's like a beneficial thing, is trying these new little tweaks, but recognizing, hey, this was a bad idea, or hey, this was a ineffective idea even, I think is really key to progressing with a brew or even modifications to a deck. And I think you hit on a very good point there of people getting caught up on things that they like versus things that are good, and then being upset when that doesn't work. And I think that returns to something that I find a lot in Pauper. Out there we have the Saffron Olives of the world who are, brewing decks in formats where cards have a generally higher impact. And I think with Pauper, a lot of the reason why the format is so sort of solidified on certain lists is a lot of cards don't necessarily have the hugest impact on the game state in Pauper. And as a result, that spicy inclusion, you may just actively be playing a worse card than you could be playing otherwise. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's what I was trying to get at as well.
Yeah. So definitely test out those spicy inclusions, but I'm here to tell you, as someone who's played a handful of spicy cards in a handful of different decks, there is a lot of value in finally saying, nope, I screwed up. This was a bad idea. Let's go back to the way it was before and moving on from there, because getting stuck in, I don't know what the term is for it, where you're just the echo chamber thing. There's an actual psychological term for this.
I think it's just called an echo chamber, is it not?
No.
Self-reinforcement. I don't know. Whatever.
There we go. That sounds technical enough. I'm not a doctor. I don't need to. No one can sue me over my non-doctor opinions. You can't.
Wow, this is still America.
True. All right. So you talked about, you brought up the idea of, getting married to your choices early on. I think one of the things that I've noticed a lot of people doing early on in deck building, or even sort of continuing it on through renditions of decks, is being very married to sort of I have chosen my 9 cards I want to play sets of. This is it. And doing basically the reverse of the spicy one of, and just going, this card is good. I always want 4 of it. And I think what we've been trying to highlight is there are cards where you don't actually want 4 of them. There are cards where you only want 2 copies of it because drawing 3 of them is miserable. And I think that's also a very important thing to sort of keep in your mind, is just because a card is good does not mean you need to run 4 of it. In some cases it does. Right. But you talked about the blue cantrips. I've run multiple lists where I've had 2 or 3 preordains in them. That's totally a thing that I've done, and it's worked out fine.
Well, Mike, that's just like your opinion,
man. But definitely, like, experiment around. Do funky things with your lists. And please don't make me break out a hypergeometric calculator. Play enough lands.
Yeah, you won't be happy if Mike has to break out his geometric calculator.
Hypergeometric.
His hypercube.
Oh man, we're gonna have a tangent in the post show for sure. Now that you've said that cursed word,
I just watched Hypercube again. I mean, I've watched it before, but yeah, we can definitely talk about Hypercube.
But I think that's another entire topic. Like, we could probably get an hour out of just talking about constructing a mana base and not playing too few lands. Please learn how to use a hypergeometric calculator. They're free on the internet. Don't be that dude who's always complaining, I never draw enough lands. It's probably
Mike, please learn how to use this incredibly advanced calculation tool.
I will literally link to a post underneath this episode explaining how to use a hypergeometric calculator for Magic card odds, because I'm tired of seeing very, very bad mana bases. I don't know if you saw, but recently an Elves list went 5-0 with like 9 forests and 4 copies of Land Grant. So
checks out, dude. Checks out.
Yeah, that's totally running 13 lands, right? That's exactly how that works.
No, we're being sarcastic.
All right. Is there anything you want to contribute on the run enough lands side tangent?
Nah, I think you've drilled it in pretty good here.
Yeah. So be cognizant of how many copies you're adding of a certain card to your deck. There is no hard and fast rule to, this is a card you always play 4 of. This is a card you always play 1 of. Sit down, think about it, analyze what your game plan is, and say, do I need this card every game? And if not, how frequently do I want to see it? And then if you're getting low enough, go, do I really need this? Because the spice must flow, but sometimes that spice is bad. Sometimes that spice is caraway seed, and it's just not good.
Yep. You heard it here.
You heard it here. Caraway seed, worst spice.
Caraway seed is the worst spice. I would not put it on green eggs and ham.
You're also vegetarian.
The ham is not. It's not real ham.
All right, we're drifting a little bit here. The mood has taken us, and Wizards cursed us by releasing a silver bordered set, so it's getting goofy in here, and I think we're just about ready to take us out of the show.
Let's do it.
I do want to quickly give a little shout out again to my local game store, JP Comics. If you're ever in the area, check them out. Really friendly bunch of people.
Mike, I will be doing the shout outs at the end of the show, Mike. If you want to add something to the script, you can add it.
All right. Can you do a shout out that we promised to one of our $3 plus patrons? Or would you like me to do it?
I did at the beginning of the show. I said Job's name, and I'm gonna make him the patron.
Okay, that's fair enough. All
All
right.
right, special shout out to Job, not in the outro, because apparently we're living in a free for all now. Are you just dumbfounded? I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to actually render you speechless.
Nope. You're good. Take us out.
Sometimes
man.
it's hard. Sometimes when we're not looking at each other in the face, it's hard to tell when we're joking. But yeah, thanks for joining us today. This podcast is brought to you by support of our patrons. Consider supporting us if you like the show. Special thanks to Job. He's our honored patron today. He's the one who submitted our conversation. Well, kind of submitted our conversation topic, or at least, spawned the discussion. So big thanks to you. Thank you for being a supporter of the show. Check this video or the description of this podcast for details on where to find us. We'd like to remind you, if you're listening to this on a platform with reviews like iTunes, they're always appreciated because they boost our visibility. If you've got a deck list or an idea for a topic, you can contact us either via our website, emailing us directly at colorcommentary@gmail.com, or signing up for our Patreon. Special thanks to Pat's Games, my LGS, for keeping it real. And special thanks to JP Comics, Mike's LGS, for also keeping it Boston. Also special thanks to L. He does our theme song, Quantitative. You can find that and other great tracks on his SoundCloud, soundcloud.net/ELLELLELL. So next week, this is Adrian and Mike, and we are signing off for Color Commentary.